All right, well, folks, we are now in our third Sunday of this Journeys of Paul sermon series, and Stephen's going to take over in a little bit and talk to us about what happened in Athens, but let's quick retrace our steps to make sure that we're all on the same page about how we got here. All right, so this is the world in Paul's time, or at least most of the known world in Paul's time, and for at least people living in this part of the world, this was about as big as they could envision, because what we're looking at, especially when you see these green boundaries here, is more or less the borders of the extent of the Roman Empire. So this is, as far as what people are able to imagine, this is a pretty big piece of area. And so Paul was born in this community right here, Tarsus, and after his conversion experience on the road between Jerusalem and Damascus down here, he had that powerful experience where Jesus said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And then Paul, after about 8 years or so, embarks on his first missionary journey, which takes him by waterway over to the island of Cyprus down here. Then they made their way up into Asia Minor, and they visited these different communities, retraced their steps, and went back. Then on the second missionary journey, he picks up a couple of new guys, a guy named Silas, and they go up here, they go across land. He picks up Silas and Timothy, and they make their way to Troas, which is where we kind of started our sermon series 2 weeks ago. Then last week we talked about how Paul had a vision from a man from Macedonia that takes him over to Philippi, which we talked about last week. He then goes down to Thessalonica and Berea, and then by land eventually gets himself down here to Athens, which is where we'll pick up our story today. And to give you a little glimpse of what Athens looks like today, obviously, lots of significant ruins from that city. The Areopagus is there, and of course, probably Stephen will tell you more about that in just a second, but let's take a look at some of the sites that you would see today in modern Athens of ancient Athens.
So I have to give you a little bit of a preface today. I came down with the flu on Monday, and it's been that flu type A. If you have had it, it is awful. Don't get it. I do not recommend 2 thumbs down. I tell you that for 2 reasons. One, if you don't like what I say today, just blame it on the flu, okay? If you do like what I say today, then you can just praise me for my strength and perseverance for carrying on, okay? So either way, we're gonna win, all right? Summer after I graduate high school, it was June, so I'd just graduated about a month before, and I was at my church, First Baptist Piedmont, Alabama, And we had talked about something, and something was named where they said, yep, and Stevie, that was my name back then, is heading off to college, blah, blah, blah. And so after the service, a lot of people were talking to me, and this one young woman came up to me, and I knew her. She had just graduated from Sanford, which is where I was going to school. And she came up to me, and she said, hey, I'm so excited you're going to Sanford, but I wanted to come and tell you something. I thought, oh, cool, insider information. And she comes over, and she says, there's this one professor. His name's Karen Joins. Whatever you do, do not take his class. I said, why, is he really hard? She said, no. If you take his class, you will lose your faith. Now I'm sitting there as an 18-year-old about to go, literally, the next day I was going for a 3-day summer orientation where I was going to sign up for my classes. And I remember having this really distinct kind of gut moment where I thought, okay, this feels like a fork in the road. This feels like I can go to college as a religion major. I can go to college and I can double down on what I think I know and have an ironclad faith that is impenetrable to anything anybody's going to say to me. Or I can go seeking truth, believing that God is truth, and if I seek truth, then maybe I'll find a God who's bigger than I can even imagine. And I remember that really critical kind of fork in the road, and literally 48 hours later, I am sitting in an advisor's office filling out my class form, and I see a name on this giant list of classes. K Joins, Hebrew 1. And I thought, oh, well, here we go. What am I going to do? And I put a checkbox, I circled it, and I wrote in the class number for Hebrew 1. Now, let me tell you something. It's a dumb idea to take Hebrew 1 your freshman year of college, okay? It's a bad idea. But it's one of the best decisions I ever made. Because I went into that class, Dr. Joins, a really tall, older man, walks in. He had this accent, and he walks in just real angrily almost. And first day of class, and he slams this big, thick Hebrew Bible down on the desk in front of me. He says, very first words to us, by the way, I don't think I believe in angels anymore. Let's do Hebrew. And that's how it started. And I remember thinking, I am on the roller coaster. I cannot get off at this point. And it was the best decision I ever made, because that decision and the decisions that followed it to seek truth, believing that I would find God, set me on a trajectory to find God in places where I never could have imagined God would be. Our scripture this morning from Acts chapter 17, Paul arrives in Athens. And we get this sense of the kind of guy that Paul was. He went in hot to Athens. It says he shows up. He immediately goes to the synagogue. He starts debating the Jews. Then he starts debating this other group of devout followers. Then he goes down to the agora, down to the market. He starts debating people there. He finds the Epicureans. He starts arguing with them. He finds the Stoics. He starts arguing with them. I mean, it's a miracle that anybody followed Jesus with Paul, because he was not a very pleasant guy. You don't get the sense, right? Even to the point where they say, what does this pretentious babbler have to say? That's Greek for what an idiot. This guy's a jerk. I wish he would stop talking. Now, we have this interesting thing that happens, though, between them calling him an idiot and a jerk and what happens at the Areopagus, which we also know as Mars Hill. Now, if you're standing at the Parthenon, and you're up on that big hill and you're looking down, there's this craggy outcrop of rock. And that's the Areopagus, also known as Mars Hill. And that was a place where people would go to debate, would go to talk philosophy, would go and talk about higher ideals. And we get this sense that Paul you get this feeling that that's where he was going to end up, right? He was going to debate these Athenians, right, and all their gods. And it said that as he walked through Athens, he was dismayed by the number of temples to other deities that he saw. But you get this interesting kind of line that happens in the verse after they call him a jerk and kind of write him off until they actually begin to talk with him again. Something about Paul changes in this one line. There's a line drawn in the sand. Now, what the text doesn't tell us, but I believe we should and could read into it, is that between the time that they're calling him a pretentious babbler and the time he ends up on Mars Hill actually having this discussion, I think some time happens between those two verses. Weeks, maybe months. And here's why. Paul has a change. Maybe it's a change of heart. Maybe it's a change of mind. Maybe it's a change of experience. Maybe he spent some time with the Athenians, and they weren't quite as bad as he thought. But something happened with Paul between those two moments. Because when he gets to Mars Hill, he has a softer tone. He has a calmer demeanor. He's not battling. He's not coming in hot. He doesn't have this combative nature. But he says, hey, when I was on my way here, I saw a temple. And that temple was inscribed to the unnamed God. And the Greek doesn't translate exactly like this, but again, I think we can read into it. I think we can hear Paul say, I saw some truth in that. I saw some truth in that temple. And I want to bring my truth, my understanding, to yours, the Athenians' truth and understanding. There was a meeting that happened there. Instead of coming in hot and angry and I'm going to tell you the right way, you get this sense of a conversation starting. I think Paul saw truth in their eyes, and that allowed them to see Paul's truth in their own eyes. I don't think Paul converted to the religion of the gods of Athens, but I think Paul recognized something that connected with something in him. And he said, I want to hold those two truths together. You know, Paul's not the only example that we have of religious leaders come in hot, believing that they have the only truth, that they have the market on truth. We can look no further than our own John Wesley. When John and his brother Charles came to the Americas, they came here literally. His stated purpose coming here was this. He wrote this in his journal. I hope to learn the true sense of the gospel of Christ by preaching it to the heathen. I came to save the Indians. Awesome. Don't want to invite him to a party, right? This is not the kind of guy you want to hang out with on a Friday night, right? He gives us a sense that I have the truth and I am going to bring it to those who have no truth. It didn't end very well for John in the Americas. John was run out of Georgia. He was embarrassed with his tail tucked between his legs. And upon reflecting back on it, he says this. He said, I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who now shall convert me? See, there's this thing that happens when we believe that we are the sole proprietors of truth. We get knocked down. And I think we see this happen with Paul. I think we see this happen with John Wesley. Because what we do is that we believe that our understanding, our own sense of truth is the apex of knowledge, of experience, of understanding. And when we do that, we put ourselves in the seat of God. Now, I think there's another way to look at this. Maybe we could call it a third way. Here in about a month, we're going to probably wear green and celebrate a funny little saint called St. Patrick. And in the 4th century, St. Patrick began his ministry in Ireland. Now, what we need to know about St. Patrick is that he was actually a slave for 6 years in Ireland, living among the Druids as a slave, before he returned back to Great Britain, was trained as clergy, and then went back as a missionary to those same Druids who had enslaved him. That's a backstory a lot of times that we don't really think about when it comes to Patrick. Another thing that I find really amazing about St. Patrick is that he didn't go in with guns blazing. He didn't take the Paul, the John Wesley, and many other religious leaders kind of route on this. He went back to Ireland with an openness, with a willingness to engage, to learn, and to experience other people's truth. He went in and lived among the Druids. He didn't come in on day one and said, I'm starting a church right here. He went and became a part of the culture. He learned their rituals and their customs, all of which he was already familiar with, having been a slave there. St. Patrick found truth in the nature-based religion of the Druids. He found truth in some of their symbols. He found truth in their connection with nature, with the cycles of the moon and with the symbols that they saw, the way that they saw deity or saw the creator in the created. So much so that 1700 years later, we have this thing called Celtic spirituality, and it came directly out of that movement. A shaping of Christianity from this nature-based religion. Because what St. Patrick saw was that there was truth in what the Druids were practicing. They didn't own all truth, and in fact, he disagreed with much of what they were doing, but he found nuggets of truth that shaped and nuanced his own faith and helped him not become less faithful to his God, but to understand and experience his God in new and profound ways. So much so that Celtic spirituality is, I believe, one of the most beautiful expressions of Christianity today. See, Patrick did what I hope that we will consider doing this morning. Patrick walked with humility. Patrick let truth inform truth. There's a really famous 20th century theologian. We have this quote up on the screen. Really famous 20th century theologian named Albert Schweitzer. And Schweitzer said this, and I believe this with all my heart. Truth has no special time of its own. Its hour is now, always. Truth has no special time of its own. Its hour is now and always. The way to think about that is that truth is without time. It's timeless, but it's always contextual. It's always here. And if we can understand our world in the way that Schweitzer understood, the way I believe Patrick understood, then we will understand that our truth is always only partially informed. Hear this again. Our truth is always only partially informed. It's never complete. It always has the ability to grow, to be refined, to be nuanced. And one of the ways it can be nuanced is by parts of the truth that others have come in and fill the gaps of our truth, of our experience, and of our knowledge. Now, I believe this is more difficult today, maybe than ever before. Xenophobia is rampant not only in our country, but in our world. People have a deep fear of the other. People fear others' experiences, others' expressions. People fear others' stories because for some reason in our mind, in our collective psyche, we believed somewhere along the line, we were convinced that if somebody else carries a light of truth, then it somehow diminishes our light of truth. And friends, there is nothing farther from the truth than that. If we believe that God is big, then we believe that God's truth exists outside of our own specific experience. So the temptation is for us to double down. The temptation is to have that ironclad belief that no one can touch, that no amount of truth can invade, that no other's experience can inform. But I believe, friends, that we must resist. We must resist those tribal and nationalistic impulses to believe that we are the only ones, and to understand that God, just as God has moved in us, God is moving in the other in the same beautiful and profound ways. And when we cut off the truth of the other, when we cut off the experience of the other, then we are cutting off the very voice of God, trying to shape and nuance our own lives. You can probably tell I'm passionate about this. And the reason why is because I have experienced this on so many levels. I remember just a year and a half after I made that decision to take Dr. Joyne's Hebrew 1 class, just a year and a half after that, I was on my very first plane trip. It's a 17-hour trip. The very first time I ever gotten on a stinking plane, and I'm flying to Amman, Jordan, as a 19-year-old kid. Spent a month there in Jordan and Syria with Muslims. I'd never met a Muslim. I'd only met one Catholic before, okay? Like, this was a big step for a kid from Piedmont, all right? And I experienced something over there that changed my life. I experienced people of another religion who were faithful, who carried a truth. Now, did I convert to Islam? No. But what it did was I learned from them. I learned from them. They taught me something. So in Christianity, hospitality is supposed to be one of our highest virtues. You see it all the way through the Bible. I never understood hospitality until I spent time with Muslims. If you ever spend time with Muslims, you will understand what hospitality looks like. In Jordan, we were constantly welcomed, greeted, given food and drink and anything, then over and over again, anything that is mine is yours. And they meant it. We have friends from Afghanistan now. You all helped give them clothes. My wife and my family and I are consistently welcomed into their tiny one-bedroom homes. And they give, and they give, and they give, and they show us what hospitality looks like in a way that has challenged my American Western sense of hospitality. And it has not only challenged it, but it has greatly nuanced my understanding of what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be hospitable. If we look at Matthew chapter 6:34, Jesus says, "Do not worry. Let tomorrow have the worries. Today has enough worries of its own." I'm a pretty anxious guy sometimes. I worry about things a lot. I think about things a lot, and I worry. I have anxiety. It wasn't until I started reading the Stoics, the Stoic philosophers, the same guys Paul was arguing with on Mars Hill. It wasn't until I started reading the Stoics that I started to get a grip on what it means to not worry. We put up on the screen here. A Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, says, "When I see an anxious person, I ask myself, what do they want? For if a person wasn't wanting something outside of their own control, why would they be stricken with anxiety?" Reading things like this, I read Stoic philosophers every single day. Reading things like this helps me have perspective. It helps me follow Jesus better. Because when Jesus tells me not to worry, I go, well, how? He doesn't elaborate, by the way. Okay, in that verse, he doesn't elaborate. But this helps me be a better Christian. We already talked about Celtic spirituality and how we can think about our spirituality as more nature-based instead of a hyper-industrialized Western existence. Ecclesiastes talks about everything has a season. And for me, I have a hard time with the part that says, and everything lives and everything dies. There's a season for everything. I get a little worried about this whole death thing. I get worried about aging. I get worried about not being physically well. I get worried about those things, and it consumes me. But then I turn to my friends who are Buddhist. I turn to one of their central teachings called the Five Remembrances, and it says this: remember, I am of the nature to grow old. I am of the nature to get sick. I am of the nature to die. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. And all that I can control are my own actions. This Buddhist teaching, this ancient Buddhist teaching, helps me not try to control everything. Helps me remember that I too shall die. I will get sick. This body will fall apart. And there's a peace to remember that we are all a part of the same journey that's reflected in Buddhism. Now again, it doesn't mean that we default our faith. It doesn't mean that we're just willy-nilly, we just believe everything. For me, it helps me understand my faith in a more profound way because truth, God, exists outside of just my own paradigms. I want to close today with this, and I hope that this will be the thing that we walk away, is that we shouldn't be afraid of the universality of truth. Again, if we're seeking truth, we will find God. I believe that at the core of my being. I remember in the late 90s, I remember seeing billboards on churches, and I remember they were advertising something really cool that they were going to be doing on Sunday nights, and it said, this Sunday night, come and join us for Jesus power stretching. And I thought, what in the heck is that? So I asked a friend who went to that church, and I said, what is that? And they said, well, what we do is we get in this quiet room, and somebody kind of says a prayer, and then we do these stretches, and then we lay on our back, and they actually have these mats. And I said, it's called yoga. No, it's Jesus power stretching, right? They were terrified to call it yoga because they were so afraid of recognizing truth in something other than their own experience. Don't call yoga Jesus power stretching. Don't be afraid of truth that exists outside of your own experience. And I'll close this with this quote by Schweitzer again, just as a reminder. Truth has no special time of its own. Its hour is now, always. Let's pray.